The human mind is capable of unimaginable horrors. Some crimes are so disturbing, so incomprehensible, that they leave even the most seasoned investigators questioning everything they know about human nature. This is one of those crimes. A young mother, quiet, unassuming, with no history of violence, was supposed to be embracing the first days of motherhood. Instead, she did something no one, no husband, no neighbor, no friend could have ever anticipated. A newborn baby, just 3 days old, vanished. No reports of a break-in, no sign of forced entry, and when authorities arrived at the modest suburban home, the truth they uncovered would shake an entire community to its core. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The house was tidy, the woman eerily calm. The smell of warm food filled the air, a homemade stew simmering on the stove, the scent rich, almost inviting. But something wasn't right. There was no crib in sight, no baby clothes, no bottles, no signs that a newborn had ever lived there at all. And then, the freezer, hidden behind frozen vegetables, wrapped tightly in plastic, was the unthinkable. Pieces of a child, her own child. The rest, already consumed. Her husband, completely unaware, had eaten the meal she prepared, the meal that contained the remains of his own son. And when investigators confronted her with the horrifying discovery, she didn't cry, she didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she simply smiled and said, "I saved him from the evil inside him." A crime so disturbing, so beyond comprehension, that it left even the most hardened detectives questioning. Was this the act of an unhinged mother suffering a psychotic break? Or was something far more terrifying at play? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss what comes next. Jessica Alvarez was the kind of woman no one noticed, soft-spoken, reserved, a young wife who spent most of her time at home while her husband worked long hours. To outsiders, there was nothing unusual about her life, just another new mother, adjusting to the exhausting demands of caring for a newborn. But inside that quiet suburban home, something had already gone terribly wrong. Jessica had given birth just 3 days earlier, a healthy baby boy. He had no name yet. Daniel wanted to pick one together after they brought him home. But there were no joyful announcements, no excited phone calls, no social media posts sharing the news of his arrival. Jessica remained silent, and when concerned relatives asked about the baby, she gave vague answers. "He's sleeping. He's not feeling well. Maybe next week." Daniel, exhausted from work, accepted her answers without question. He trusted his wife. After all, she had always been a quiet person, often keeping to herself. But there was something off. She barely slept. She refused to let him into the nursery. The baby monitor sat untouched on the dresser, turned off. And in the moments when he did catch a glimpse of her, he saw something in her eyes he couldn't explain. A blankness, a distance, as if she was somewhere else entirely. Neighbors would later recall that in those 3 days, they never once heard the sound of a crying infant. No late-night feedings, no fussing, just silence. Then, on the evening of March 15th, 2023, Daniel stepped through the front door after a long shift at the construction site. The house was warm, filled with the rich, savory aroma of home-cooked stew. It was a welcome change. Jessica hadn't cooked in weeks. As he set down his things and walked toward the kitchen, he saw her standing at the stove, stirring. Her posture was relaxed, calm, as if nothing was wrong. "You're just in time," she said, placing a steaming bowl in front of him. "I made your favorite." He sat down, thankful for the meal, completely unaware of the horror that had already unfolded in that very room. He had no idea that in the hours before he arrived home, his wife had done something unthinkable, something no mother should ever be capable of. And now, sitting at the dinner table, unaware, He was about to consume the evidence. The house at 214 Maplewood Drive had always been quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made neighbors uneasy, though they couldn't quite say why. Jessica Alvarez and her husband Daniel had lived there for 3 years, blending into their suburban surroundings like any other young couple. A modest home, a small yard, a life that on the surface seemed perfectly normal. But on March 12th, 2023, something changed, something subtle at first, small details that seemed insignificant on their own, but together they painted a far more disturbing picture. It started with the silence, the kind of silence that lingers in the air, thick and unnatural, where sound should exist but doesn't. Jessica had just given birth. A baby boy. Yet not a single cry was ever heard from that house. No late-night wailing, no muffled sounds of an infant being rocked to sleep. Just nothing. Then there was the music. A soft, eerie lullaby is drifting from an upstairs window. It played on repeat, night after night, winding down, stopping, only to start again. The same haunting melody, over and over. Neighbors thought it was strange, but no one said anything. After all, new parents did odd things. Maybe it was helping the baby sleep. Except no one had seen the baby. Not once. Friends and family had started asking questions. They expected photos, an announcement, a name. But Jessica remained distant. Her voice, when she answered the phone, was hollow and detached. He's sleeping. He's with family. Maybe next week. But next week never came. When visitors knocked, Jessica wouldn't answer. Curtains remained drawn. The front door locked. Daniel didn't push. He was working long hours, often coming home too exhausted to notice the way his wife had changed. When she stood at the kitchen sink, staring blankly into the running water. When she sat in the rocking chair in the nursery, holding something. An empty blanket, cradling it, whispering under her breath. He told himself it was normal, that she was adjusting to motherhood, that she was just tired. But the truth was, Jessica was already gone. March 17th, 11:47 p.m. Daniel was looking for his phone charger when he found it, a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath Jessica's pillow. He had never seen it before, never knew she kept a diary. At first, he hesitated. It felt wrong to invade her privacy. But something in his gut, something he couldn't quite explain, compelled him to open it. The handwriting was frantic, uneven, words etched deep into the paper as if written in a state of panic. Disjointed sentences, repeated phrases, and then one line that sent a chill through his body. He will always be part of us. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He turned the pages faster now, scanning through incoherent ramblings, numbers that meant nothing, and symbols he didn't understand. And then a final entry. A single sentence, scrawled across the last page in bold, erratic strokes. Tonight is the night. Daniel's hands were shaking. His heart was pounding. He felt a weight pressing against his chest, something suffocating, something wrong. He stumbled backward, the journal slipping from his grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. He needed air. He needed to think. And then he needed to call the police. When officers arrived at 214 Maplewood Drive, they didn't know what to expect. A domestic dispute, maybe. A woman struggling with postpartum depression. A misunderstanding. But when Jessica opened the door, every instinct in their bodies told them that something was terribly, terribly wrong. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't confused. Instead, she stepped aside, tilting her head slightly, almost as if inviting them in, as if she had been expecting them. The air inside the house was warm, too warm, the kind of heat that clings to your skin, making it hard to breathe. And beneath it, beneath the thick, stifling humidity, there was something else. A smell. Rich, heavy, the unmistakable scent of slow-cooked meat. Jessica led them toward the kitchen without a word. The stove was still on. A pot sat on the burner, steam curling lazily toward the ceiling. An officer stepped forward, his pulse hammering in his ears, his stomach twisting into knots. He reached for the lid. Inside, chunks of meat, softened by hours of slow cooking. Small bones, delicate and brittle, floating just beneath the surface. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of what they were seeing was too much, too heavy, pressing down like a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Then, a whisper. "He will always be part of us." Jessica's voice was quiet, gentle, a mother's voice, a lullaby on the edge of sleep. And as she spoke, a faint smile touched her lips. But the horror wasn't over. Not yet. An officer turned, moving down the hall. Something was pulling him toward the back of the house, a sound, a vibration in the air. Jessica had started humming, a song they didn't recognize, something soft, rhythmic. It was coming from the freezer. Slowly, he reached for the handle. Pull it open. Inside, wrapped in layers of plastic, was the rest of the body. The missing child. The newborn is just 3 days old, frozen, preserved, as if waiting for something. Jessica tilted her head again, her eyes calm, her expression unreadable, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He's still here." The interrogation room was small, sterile. A single flickering light cast long shadows against the walls. Jessica Alvarez sat motionless at the metal table, her hands resting in her lap, fingers still, breath even. Across from her, the detectives watched, waiting for a sign of emotion, a tear, a tremble, a flicker of regret. There was none. Jessica's face was blank, her dark eyes unblinking, her lips pressed into a faint, unreadable line. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost childlike. Matter of fact. "I wanted him to be with us forever." The detectives exchanged glances. One of them leaned forward, his voice careful, measured. "Jessica, do you understand what you've done?" Jessica blinked, tilted her head slightly. Then, in that same quiet voice, she said, "I saved him." For the next 20 minutes, Jessica told her story, a story so unsettling, so deeply unnerving, that even the most seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were hearing. Jessica spoke with no hesitation, no remorse. She said it started with the whispers. Late at night, when the house was silent, she could hear them. Soft at first, a voice in the baby's room, calling her name. Then came the shadows, flickering at the edge of her vision, moving just beyond the light, shapes that shouldn't be there. And then the realization. "He wasn't my son," she whispered. "He wasn't human." The detectives shifted uncomfortably. "Jessica, what do you mean?" She inhaled slowly, closing her eyes. "I knew from the moment he was born. He wasn't crying. He was watching. His eyes. They weren't right." Jessica claimed that every time she looked at her baby, she felt wrong, like something inside her was being drained. She described an overwhelming sense of dread, an intrusive, suffocating feeling that her child was not a child at all, but something else, something to watch, waiting. She said she could hear him breathing, even when he was asleep. When she closed her eyes, she could feel him crawling toward her. And then, on the third night, she saw it. She swore that when she looked into the crib, she saw his face change. "His eyes turned black," she whispered, "like pits, empty. He smiled at me, but it wasn't a baby's smile." Jessica said she knew then what she had to do. She had to save them. Herself, Daniel, the house, her family. And there was only one way. She smothered him with a pillow, held it down until the house fell silent, and then She cradled him in her arms, rocking him back and forth, humming the same lullaby she had played every night. "I had to bring him back to us," she murmured. "I had to make sure he was always with us." Jessica's confession was met with stunned silence. The detectives, hardened by years of witnessing the worst in humanity, felt something they rarely experienced in that room: a chill. She spoke about her actions as if they were rational, as if she had been following instructions only she could hear. But the question remained: was Jessica Alvarez truly suffering from postpartum psychosis, or was there something else lurking beneath the surface? Postpartum psychosis is rare, but when it occurs, it's devastating. Unlike postpartum depression, which affects 1 in 7 women, postpartum psychosis affects only 1 or 2 in every 1,000. It's not just sadness or exhaustion, it's a complete break from reality. Experts described the symptoms: hallucinations, paranoia, and delusions. A warped perception of the world, where a mother might believe her child is in danger, or worse, that her child isn't human at all. But something about Jessica's case didn't sit right. Most mothers experiencing postpartum psychosis act in a state of frantic desperation, panic, guilt. But Jessica, she was calm, detached. Her voice never wavered. There was no remorse, no confusion, just a certainty that what she did was necessary. The question remained: was she truly lost in a delusional break? Or had something much darker always been inside her? The investigators thought they had reached the bottom of the story, that they had heard the worst of it. But then Jessica said something else. A second confession. A confession that sent an icy wave of terror through the entire room. Jessica tilted her head, staring at the detectives with an expression they couldn't quite place. And then she said, "It wasn't the first time." "What do you mean?" Jessica's lips parted slightly, her voice barely a whisper now, but the words were clear, unmistakable. "It wasn't the first time. I had to do this." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The trial that had captivated the public was nearing its end, and with each passing day, new revelations came to light. Jessica's defense team, in their attempt to shield her from the full weight of the law, argued that she was suffering from postpartum psychosis. This, they claimed, had rendered her incapable of understanding the monstrous nature of her actions. It was a diagnosis that many were familiar with, one often used to explain cases of mothers who harm their children in moments of extreme mental distress. But the prosecution wasn't so easily swayed. They presented a chilling counter-narrative, one that suggested Jessica had not simply snapped under the pressure of motherhood, but had carefully orchestrated every step of the crime. In their eyes, this was no desperate act of a woman out of control. This was a premeditated, calculated decision to murder her child and feed him to her husband, a grotesque act that was far too deliberate to be dismissed as insanity. The courtroom was filled with tension as both sides made their final arguments, each side trying to convince the jury of their version of events. As the defense team closed, Jessica sat in the defendant's chair, her face betraying no emotion. But when the prosecution's turn came, something unexpected happened. Daniel, Jessica's husband, stood up from his seat in the gallery, his eyes bloodshot with grief, his hands trembling as he held back tears. It was clear from the moment he spoke that he had been broken, devastated by the realization of what had happened. The jury listened in stunned silence as he spoke about the torment of learning the truth. That he had unknowingly consumed the remains of his own child, that the meal he had shared with his wife was the flesh of his son. For Daniel, it was a truth so incomprehensible, so overwhelmingly painful, that it shattered his entire world. His love for Jessica, the woman he had married, now felt like a distant memory, a cruel lie. His trust had been obliterated, and in its place was a raw, agonizing grief that no one could truly understand. He had been a victim, too, but one who had never seen the danger lurking so close to home. The trial had become more than just a legal battle. It was a deep, unspoken examination of what made someone capable of such horrific actions. The jury deliberated for hours, weighed down by the emotional gravity of the case. They knew the facts. They knew the law. But the question at the heart of the case was one they couldn't escape. Was Jessica really insane, or was this something far darker, an act of malice disguised as madness? Finally, the moment arrived. The verdict. Jessica was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom went quiet, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The gravity of the decision was immense, but the true shock came moments later, when the judge sentenced Jessica not to a prison cell, but to a psychiatric institution. It was a decision that left many in the courtroom stunned. Was she truly a danger to society, or was this merely the result of an uncontrollable mental break? For Daniel, the verdict didn't bring closure. It couldn't. How do you move on from something so unspeakable? His mind was still reeling, still trying to process the horror that had consumed his life. In a matter of months, his world had been destroyed, and he had no choice but to walk away. He filed for divorce immediately, leaving the state in search of a fresh start, a new life far away from the woman he had once loved and the life he had once known. As the trial ended and the dust settled, the world was left with one burning question. Was Jessica really insane, or was she just an ordinary woman who committed an extraordinary crime? The lines between right and wrong, sanity and madness, became blurred, and as the years passed, the case would haunt everyone involved, a dark reminder of how easily trust can be shattered and how the human mind is capable of both unimaginable cruelty and devastating weakness. But here's the real question that lingers, unanswered. Was this truly the result of a breakdown, or was Jessica simply using postpartum psychosis as an excuse to escape the consequences of her own actions? It's a question that may never find a clear answer, and one that will forever leave a shadow over the lives of those caught in its wake. The story you've just heard is one that will haunt anyone who listens to it. But here's the real question. Do you think Jessica was truly insane? Or did she know exactly what she was doing when she committed such an unthinkable act? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was it a moment of madness or something far more calculated? I want to hear your opinions on this chilling case. And if you love unsettling true crime stories like this one, then don't go anywhere. The next case is even more disturbing, and you won't believe the twists it takes. You can click right here to watch it. If this story shocked you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you think you have the courage to delve even deeper into the darkest corners of true crime, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell.